Hello and welcome to the Worn and Wound podcast. My name is Blake Bettner. Today I'm happy to be joined by Blake Mallon in studio. Blake, welcome to the podcast.
What's up? Thanks for having me.
We've also got Zach Weiss over here. Zach, how are you doing? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very hot. Thanks.
And I'm also really excited about today's guest. He's a good friend of ours. He is automotive enthusiast, golf podcaster. I think he's into watches. Maybe he is Ben Clymer. Ben Clymer, welcome to the Worn and Wound podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Blake. It's an honor to be here with you guys. You know, you and I have worked together and known each other for a long time, and the other guys as well. You know, a lot of love for what Worn and Wound has meant to the industry and community. So happy to be here for sure. Yeah,
definitely. So it's been. You may have heard we're celebrating the 10-year. Well, Worn and Wound is collectively celebrating. You guys are celebrating your 10-year anniversary this year, which is amazing. And HODINKEE, I guess it's been a few years now since you guys had that.
Yeah, it was 2000. We did it at the end of 2018, which we launched in 2008. As you know, Blake, I mean, it was just me back then, and there was no business or anything. But we still did our 10-year anniversary in 2018. And, you know, so I guess we're on year 13 right now, which is pretty wild. I don't think I've done anything else in my life for 13 years consecutively besides HODINKEE.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. Before we get any deeper, should we do, is it okay if we do a wrist check, Ben? You got a watch on?
Strangely, I don't have a watch on right now, but I have several watches in front of me. To be totally honest, I just got out of the shower and kind of raced over here and sat down. But I would say the watch that is closest to me right now is our limited edition Oris that we did a few years ago, hand wound, the special Oris.
Yeah.
But I mean, I could rattle off 10 watches that I have in front of me, including a Big Crown Tudor. I've got a 15202. I've got our IWC. You know, it's kind of like summer watch season. So over here, I've got, what do I have? Well, that's not a summer watch. I've got our Corn de Vache. Actually, this is probably my chief summer watch, which is our Skipper that we did in 2017.
Excellent.
This one kind of doesn't leave the wrist in the summertime. So I would say if I were to be wearing a watch today, it'd probably be this one.
Yeah, I love that watch.
Very appropriate for the season.
That was an early one, too.
It was 2017 when we did that one.
Yeah. Blake Mallon, what are you wearing?
Sure. It's always fun following Ben Clymer on What's on Your Wrist. Thanks very much, Ben.
Sorry about that, yeah.
No worries. I'm actually wearing our Zodiac Super Seawolf Limited Edition that we released a few weeks ago.
It's a good summer watch, too.
Yeah, great summer watch. Super fun, easy to wear, really colorful. It's like, it's definitely a staple of the summer.
Yeah. Zach Weiss, what about you?
I have on vintage Seiko chronograph, the 6139 7010.
Oh, cool.
My first vintage watch I ever purchased, and one of the few watches that has remained in my collection for a while. Everything else seems to kind of escape me at some point, but this hasn't.
It happens to all of us. I'm wearing the new Group B Night Stage 3 from Autodromo. With this, we just got this today. I'm pretty excited. It's very light red. It's perfect for summer. It's very appropriate, and I love these things. I've got a big soft spot, and I think we're all big fans of what Bradley's doing over there. So, always happy to show him some love. Josh, you got a watch on over there? What are you wearing?
I've got the only watch that is not broken in my collection, which is my DW 5600.
Okay, yeah.
Very hard watch to break.
Yeah,
exactly. Cool. Yeah. So Ben, we mentioned it earlier. It's 10 years for us, and I thought it'd be fun for us to kind of get together and talk about maybe some of the early days, some of the surprises, and the journey that we've all had through here.
Yeah.
So I think maybe it would be fun to start by. Do you remember the first time that you came across Blake and Zach and Worn and Wound in general?
I remember the first time we met, and then I certainly remember something that I heard about the Worn and Wound guys, and it was from actually Bradley. From Bradley Price. And, Bradley remains a very good friend of mine. I mean, he's in Italy right now. I'm very jealous of that. But, he and I talk all the time, mostly about cars, to be honest with you, but, occasionally about watches, and back then certainly more about watches. And he said, in whatever year it was, something along the lines like, hey, you should check these guys out. Like, they're pretty good. And, me being me, it's like, yeah, whatever. I'm sure they're okay. Just because as we all know, like there's so many kind of knuckleheads in this industry, in particular back then, actually probably more so now than back then, that it's like, it's really easy to just assume that like anybody else in this space is the one thing I'll say is I speaking for myself, and Blake was there, like I went to journalism school to write about watches. You know what I mean? Like I really took this thing seriously in a way that at least back then I didn't think other people were capable of. And then I met these guys. And I was like, okay, like there are other people that have the same kind of, respect for quality and integrity in this space. And that was the Worn and Wound guys. So, the first mention I heard of them was from Bradley Price, and he just said, hey, check them out. I think James Lambden, who was a mutual friend of ours as well. It's funny how even to this day, everyone is kind of interconnected. Mm-hmm. He also made, really, kind of glowing, mentions of the Worn and Wound site. And that was when I first kind of heard of Worn and Wound. And then I think we first met at a bar in the East 30s with Lambden, I think. You guys can
I think it was,
on that. Does that
I think
sound
it
right?
was his birthday party. I think it was a very awkward way to meet him as well in person. We'd only been talking
right.
over DM on Instagram at that point.
Sure.
And Bradley made the introduction. Then we went to this party where everyone knew each other very well, and then we showed up. So
that sounds right. But James used to have. I don't know. He knew the bartender or something. There was some connection to this bar in the East 30s. It was actually a pretty nice place, and you guys were there, and we met, and that was it. And just been kind of friends in the space for a long time ever since. And I think that's one of the nice things about this industry is that you do see the same people over and over again, whether it's at Basel or in the other trade shows or at the New York events. I've been to your events. I think you've been to ours. It's all one, at least in New York, it's one kind of happy family in this space.
Yeah, I guess that's the interesting part, right? Doing this in the same city. I know you were guys, it was kind of like you're talking about the same things, obviously from a broad perspective, but you did kind of take two different paths, right? And I know that you guys kind of started out looking pretty much exclusively at watches under $1,000. Is that the price cap that you guys had set?
The earliest price cap that we ever formalized was $5,000, and that was as a challenge to somebody that at a Red Bar meetup said there aren't any good watches under $5,000. We're like, well, now we know exactly what we have to prove, and that kind of has melted away, as you know. But that was the soft price cap. But we sort of, I think we're just maybe a bit contrarian by nature, and when everyone was going one way, we're like, no, we got to go the other way, for better or worse. I
have to say, I remember being at that bar and being. And this is a feeling that was repeated many times over the years and still happens. I mean, a lot less now, but being completely fish out of water and completely intimidated by everybody in the room. And I have to say, not to make too much of a glowing comment about Ben, but I feel like you've always really kind of made us comfortable and really showed respect for us and kind of treated us as an equal, which I've always really appreciated. And I just, you've always sort of expressed that sort of mutual admiration for what we're doing. And I think in my, own personal mind has helped me a lot feel like a part of the club. A part of the watch community in a way that an industry that frankly is very focused on luxury and not so much on what we're doing all the time doesn't. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean that's very kind of you, and it's completely organic. And again, the folks that I respect in this space are not the people that can afford or even cover the most expensive stuff. It's the people that do things the right way. And I've said this a million times since the beginning of HODINKEE. I just believe in a meritocracy, and it's if Worn and Wound can do something for brand X, and if HODINKEE can do something for brand X, they should both work with both of us. If Ariel Adams can do something for brand X, they should work with them. If anybody can do anything for anybody, that makes sense to me. And I have nothing but respect for people that have built things that have tangible, actionable value to their businesses. That is not to say that there aren't dozens of other folks that have a different kind of value, but there are many people in this space that really don't have any value at all without any real audiences or anything, but there's so much kind of hype around them that in-person relationships just kind of drag them into, kind of quote unquote influence. So, when I look at what Worn and Wound has done over the last 10 years, it's you guys have found your niche and you've done it exceptionally well. And, I think, again, not just because I'm on your podcast, I think you won't be surprised to learn that of all the other websites out there are a few that I think compared to what you guys do in terms of quality and integrity and the ability to kind of really connect with your readership. And I mean, again, there's so many websites out there that don't allow comments, for example. We obviously do. I know you guys do too. Any website, I've said this before on other platforms, any website that doesn't allow comments is hiding something. That's why I view it, in this category, it's either there is actually no readership, or there's not anybody that cares enough to comment. And I think the one thing that I can at least say about us is look, we get dragged on Instagram every day, and all that means is people care. And I think that the thing that the thing that we see with when I'm looking at companies to invest in or friends, companies that we're working with or whatever, if you're getting no good or bad feedback, that's far worse than getting kind of publicly bad feedback. And you guys get great feedback, and I think that says a lot about your audience and your ability to connect with people. And it means that you matter,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned social and Instagram and that kind of whole world. That has changed a lot in the last 10 years. I think it's fair to say. Right. What, have you been surprised at the role that that's taken on in creating the kind of, hype that you see around certain watches today, and how it's affected the kind of core, quote unquote enthusiast group that we kind of know and love and identify with? Do you think it's been a net positive or not?
I think it's absolutely been a net positive for the industry. I mean, I think that there's not times where it's really annoying, but overall, you have to hold in high regard the positivity. And as I said before, I believe in meritocracy. Instagram in particular has changed the collectibles market: watches, cars, fashion, sneakers, baseball cards, you name it, the whole thing. I mean, Instagram changed that for everyone. In the sense that the market is just so much wider now, and people that would have a very loose interest in any of these categories are now fed it literally in their discover page on Instagram all the time. If let's say somebody follows HODINKEE, and then all of a sudden, maybe they get fed a Revolution post or a Worn and Wound post or whatever, or vice versa. And all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, I saw that thing on HODINKEE. What's Worn and Wound got to say about it? What's Waco got to say about it, et cetera? So there's no question it's been a net positive in terms of breadth and width. The depth, I would say maybe not. I think at scale probably it still does. But, there's this idea, and I've talked about this a lot recently, about the homogenation of taste, where everybody wants the same shit, which, I think it's kind of funny for me to say this probably from your vantage point now, but I started HODINKEE as a contrarian as well. I didn't know anything about watches, didn't know anything about media, wanted to only talk about vintage watches, which were wholly not a thing at that point, completely not a thing. And so, it's funny how, 13 years later, now, vintage was so hot for so long, and now modern watches are back. But only 5 modern watches. I mean, it's effectively 5 watches that people really care about, and the rest is kind of lost in the ether. I do wish that smaller brands had more power. I do wish that Instagram would the hive on Instagram would reward creativity and independence more than they do. But it is what it is. I mean, I think I'd be foolish to complain about social media's influence on this business at all, because we use it all day, every day, and it's been wonderful to us.
Yeah. You mentioned the vintage watch thing, and that was kind of my foray into it as well, just from kind of bombing around you with in the early years and being exposed to the things that you were looking at and traveling, and there's a million stories there, but there was kind of a romantic part of the vintage thing and discovering the stories that you kind of fall hard and fast on. But I was listening to you having a discussion with our friend John Reardon on his podcast, Collectability, I think it's called, which is great.
Yep.
And you mentioned something that I had been feeling kind of the last a year or two as well, in kind of your shift from the vintage worlds into focusing on more new stuff. And I know I have kind of my own reasons, which are many and probably personal as well, that I made that shift. But I wanted to kind of get you to talk about that a little bit more, just because I know from the early days, this vintage stuff is really cool, but that world has changed a lot. It's a very scary place now. The attention that it's grabbed, from Franken watches to fakes to, I feel like it's a whole different world now, right? Yeah. And the motivations have changed as well.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, certainly, at least in my kind of tenure in this space, I think there's kind of 3 eras: the 2008 to 2011-12 era, which was pretty pure and driven by folks like the early HODINKEEs, guys that were just kind of nerding out and learning about it publicly, and that's what made HODINKEE in the early days. Is as you guys know, I didn't know anything, and I was learning as I went along, and I would just kind of transcribe it, and people would follow along. And then I think things started to change. I think really around when the first Daytona sale took place, the one that Arel held at Christie's. It was I think Daytona Ultimatum or something, 2014 or 15. The very first time a Daytona sold for $1 million, which now is I wouldn't say it's commonplace, but it happens semi-regularly. And that became these steel watches are really expensive. They're always expensive, but now we're talking 7 figures. They're outpacing Pateks, which is historically wild. And then the Daytona, kind of hit fever pitch when, and I say Daytona, but what I really mean is I use that as kind of the archetype of all vintage watches. It hit fever pitch when Paul Newman's watch sold in 2018 for $18.8 million. And then people were just fanatical about it. And then people started to get burned by the vintage Rolex world or vintage watch world in general. And now it's a mixed bag. And I think, we're in a slightly, relative to the vintage conversation, we're in a healthier place where a lot of guys that I know from the HODINKEE community that are wealthy guys or, rather well-to-do dudes that are loosely into watches, they were buying vintage Rolexes and they may or may not have gotten burned. And now they want to buy modern watches. And the one thing I'll say, there's a lot of hype around modern and it infuriates me just as much as it does to anybody. But the number of fakes and issues and service issues and all that is wildly less significant in modern watches than it is vintage. And I think for that reason alone, I'm happy about that shift. Because it looked bad for all of us, even though, it's not like we did any of this stuff. It looked bad for the entire industry when public lawsuits were taking place, when very well-to-do people that are not celebrities were suing dealers, which happened all the time, or auction houses, which happens all the time. And it's because hey, I bought this Seafoam Stella dial for $100,000 at Christie's, and Rolex itself says it's not real, but the dealer who, we all would know and hold in high regard says it is. And then you've got this guy being like, wait a minute, I bought it at Christie's, which is a blue chip name, or insert Phillips, Sotheby's, whatever. Rolex themselves says it's not real. You're inclined to believe Rolex, right? But then you have this dealer who is, a kingmaker in this space, so to speak, saying, hey, well, wait a minute, I think it is real. Rolex doesn't know what they're talking about. And if you came in from any other industry, and you're telling me the guys who made this, one of the most impressive brands on the planet in any industry, doesn't know what they're talking about? What do you? How could you even suggest that? And the thing is that dealer may have been right. Rolex maybe didn't know that dial was real. Yeah. But it's just talk about a murky area that doesn't lend credibility to an entire category. And that stuff happened at scale. And I think that is part of the reason why a few individuals were you know what? I'm happy with the vintage I got. I'm going to enjoy it for what it is. But if I'm going to spend real money on something, I want to know it's real. And I think that's fair enough. And to be clear, I've got 2 or 3 vintage watches sitting right here that I love and will probably always keep. But does that mean, sorry, I was getting a text from Jack. I need to turn that off.
Hey, Jack.
Jack Forrester, go away, Jack. But it doesn't mean that I believe that they're all good. I've had bad vintage watches in my own collection. And it's a scary thing out there. And then again, I think my idea of collecting has changed a lot where I want watches. I said this to Reardon. I want watches that mean something to me now. And vintage watches don't necessarily transmit in that way because they've lived somebody else's life. Having said that, there's a possibility of connecting those things. As I said on John's podcast, I love watches that have a New York connection as a New Yorker. I said on his pod as well, there is, I don't want to call it anti-American, but there's definitely a slight aversion to kind of American sensibilities in the luxury world, not just watches. I am wholly American. I do not speak French. I don't think you guys do either, but correct me if I'm wrong. And so it's I always felt like an outsider. And so, the idea of a Patek Philippe signed Cartier, or vice versa, a Cartier signed Patek Philippe being purchased in New York City in 1967, that person probably felt a little bit of what I felt. And those are the type of watches that I want to buy, which is why, on the rare occasion I do buy a modern Patek Philippe, I buy them from Tiffany because it is a great American retailer of Patek watches in New York City. So, a lot has changed, but a lot has stayed the same. And look, you show me a great box and papers, new old stock Rolex that is original owner, I'm going to be excited by it. And that'll never change, but I'm not hunting them like I used to, for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
I also just find my 2 cents in this, which are, I'm not a vintage person. I have not been immersed in the world nearly as much as you have, and I was always sort of limited by what I could spend, especially early on. Back in the 2011 to 2013, 14 is maybe when I was most interested in it, and it was purely from a perspective of the variety that was available in vintage watches in terms of design, because at the time I'd say modern watches were a lot more boring. There was not a lot going on. There was a lot less brands, particularly in the micro brand scene. And, I feel like since then, the diversity, the variety has caught up. And now you can find what you want. You can find something interesting, something that's trying new things, that's something that's funky. But I do miss those days where you could sort of rummage around and virtually rummage, if you will, and find some weird watch, like a Sakura or I don't even know the names, Giganda, these weird brands. And they were $400, $500, and now that Newman tide, I suppose, lifted those up, but now they're a few $1,000s, and even at that price point, it's like that risk of the, not knowing the service history, all that stuff, it just compounds, and it's like not worth it anymore. The fun is gone, for me at least, in buying that kind of just like, screw it, this is a cool looking watch.
Yeah, it's hard to enjoy in the same kind of way that you would have before. But even like the discovery part is the fun part, though, right? Like the learning about it. You find it in a car and you're like, what the hell is this brand? And then that takes you down a whole rabbit hole, right?
It sure does. And it's so, look, I mean, we have been criticized. I personally have been criticized ruining Universal Chat, whatever that means. And it's just like,
way to go.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And it's one of those things where it's like, it's hard to really understand how these things happen. Like I can tell you, like HODINKEE didn't sell vintage watches until relatively recently, And so me just like blogging about it in the early days certainly didn't ruin it by itself. There were actors on the other side, on the commercial side, that were selling these things. I would see a story by me or by you, Blake, when you were with HODINKEE, or Jason Heaton or whoever, Eric Wynn, and say, oh, wait a minute, like, Blake wrote this story. That means these are probably going to pop. And so they buy up all of them. But like, we weren't doing that for sure. Nothing happens without somebody on the other side of the space, acting with commercial mindset, which is totally valid and totally fair. And, to be clear, both HODINKEE and Worn and Wound now do that. Like we sell watches, and that's how we pay our salaries, et cetera. So all is fair. But it's funny to see how, sites like Worn and Wound and HODINKEE kind of led dealers to pay attention to different things. And that's not to say we knew anything that they didn't. In fact, it was probably the opposite way. It just is that we had the loudest megaphone. And I think, at least in our cases, we had a voice that kind of resonated at the right pitch as well as the right volume. And then all of a sudden, micro brands became hot, and vintage watches became hot. And then, modern watches became hot. And again, we are not alone in this for sure. And Instagram certainly played a huge part in it. But it's been interesting to see, just this change in taste over the past X number of years. It's who knows what's next. That's what people want to know right now. I read a report somewhere saying that gray market prices of Rolex sports watches are actually stagnant right now. They're still extremely high, but they're not continuing to rise like they were in the first few months. And I wonder if they're going to come back down, or if it's just going to keep on going. And then it basically, people will be buying, as I said, 5 or 6 watches at scale forever at exorbitant prices, or if those are going to kind of come back down to earth, and you'll be able to buy a Girard-Perregaux as well as a Rolex at the same price. Yeah,
I think that's important, though, and welcome. And do you think this whole thing has kind of pushed people into discovering other brands that they otherwise wouldn't have? Right? It's like, well, I want this Pepsi GMT, but I'm not going to pay $25,000 for it or $20,000 for it. What else is out there? They discover Grand Seiko. They discover, a million of micro brands.
I wonder if this whole kind of new thing that's happening with brands like Corona Tokyo and Ming and even Louis Erard, selling out in a day, brands that kind of would have been I don't even know, like 5-6 years ago, smaller, independent, but not high end. There's a kind of, it's almost like a new genre or kind of style of independent brand. Would those be selling out if the Rolexes were available? I mean, maybe they still would, because the watches and the brands are interesting enough, the numbers are limited enough, but I feel like you can't get this other thing that's so desirable, so people are creating new desirability.
I think what we see, we have some investors that kind of look at collectibles markets pretty broadly, like baseball cards, sneakers, the whole thing. And what we see in talking with them is people just want to be a part of the wave. And so FP Journe, I think, is one of the models of this right now. FP Journe, as I think you guys would remember, 4 or 5 years ago, they were trading for cents on the dollar at retail. I'm not even talking in the secondary market, yes, but you could walk into a boutique and get a Journe Tourbillon for below retail. You could get a Resonance for below retail. And then all of a sudden, it became a thing. And, I credit to the Dufour thing. Dufour, obviously much smaller production, but, Dufour started popping off at auction in a crazy way for simplicity, which is as the name might connote, is really a very simple watch. Dufour, Journe, now Moser, you mentioned Louis Erard, MB&F, all these brands that we've all known, and kind of in some ways, I'm super happy for their success. In other ways, and they probably feel the same about me, back in the day, we used to hang out and drink together at Basel. And now it's now it just doesn't feel that way, because they're selling so many watches and, catering to a very particular kind of buyer set. And to be clear, it's not like we haven't changed either. So, pot, kettle, the whole thing. But, it's one of those things where it's just funny to see the Journes, the Mosers, the MB&Fs, who are all amazing watchmakers. And, we love those guys, really have such different fates commercially than they ever did before. And they deserve it. Like, those guys are making special things, arguably more special than say a Rolex or an Omega or a Tag or anything like that. But it's one of those things where like the tide is lifting every boat there is right now. Mm-hmm. And if you walk into the Vacheron's new boutique on 57th Street, which I recommend, it's really beautiful. There's not an Overseas or Historiques watch anywhere in the entire store. You can't buy an Overseas at the brand new open flagship. Overseas fine, steel sports watch, put it aside. How about Historiques, which is like basically a vintage watch? Can't get that either. And I just think this is not a Royal Oak, this is not a Nautilus, and you still can't get it. And I think it's really, I think, Blake, you're right in the sense that it really is trickling to other brands. And we're an Omega dealer, and I can tell you that we are selling so many freaking Omegas you can't even imagine. We are selling so many Tag Heuers you can't imagine. And like these brands that they're wonderful brands, they're flagship brands, but they're not Rolex. And the frustration at Rolex, it's not even a question anymore. Back in the day, you might say, "Oh, put your name down, you'll get a call in a year." Like now, it's like, unless you have a 7-figure relationship with these guys, you're probably not going to get a dealer unless you went to college with the owner's son or something like that. It's a totally different world. But look, the fact that it's helping out brands like Max Booster and FP and Moser and brands that have been doing it the right way for a long time, I really do appreciate. Even the Omegas and Tag Heuers of the world, like, we're great brands. They don't need charity from anybody, but like, I do like that the lack of availability for Rolex is forcing people to look at other options, and then they fall in love with these other options and never look back.
Yeah, absolutely. So back in the early days, it was easy to get excited about some watches. We were still kind of in a discovery phase. This is one thing I enjoy reading. You've got this guy, Danny Milton, I think, on your team. Yeah, I kind of like see a lot of myself and maybe us, because just from the early days and like that discovery, you kind of see like where he's at on that journey. Yep. What do you like? Do you have a watch now? And I've asked these guys this before as well. Like, do you have watches now that you go back to that kind of brings that early joy back? Like, oh, I remember this watch from 2010 and how excited I was to get it, or what this watch meant to me, or my journey in this whole thing. Do you have watches that kind of bring you back to earth?
I do, definitely. And, there's a few, look, I mean, like anybody, I buy, sell, trade all the time. There's a few vintage watches that bring me back. One of them is the Universal Genève, the Pete Fullerton watch, which was Henry Graves' grandson. Yeah. Henry Graves, of course, super complication. He's he's the archetype of the New Yorker that like really, like, he basically saved Patek Philippe, who, arguably is responsible for like all of the complications that we now know in watchmaking. So he's kind of a hero to me, and his grandson was named Pete Fullerton. He bought him a Tricompax Universal at Henry Stern in New York in 1948, and I bought that watch at Sotheby's from John Reardon in the Henry Graves sale for like $2,300. Still have it. We'll never sell it. And this is really like, this watch was purchased by Henry Graves, which is pretty wild. We now know that. Been serviced one time. That one I still have, and like, I don't know, will I keep it forever? I'm inclined to say yes. If I didn't, I would probably put it up for auction and donate all the money to charity or something like that. It's not a super valuable watch, I don't think, anyway, but it's just a really important thing to me, because that really led to my discovery of complicated dress watches, if that makes any sense. It was my first like small chronograph, dressy chronograph. I bought it well before I could afford a Patek, for sure. It kind of gave off the steel Patek vibes, at $2,300. That one's a really important one to me. I have a 1963 Hoya Carrera that I bought off of eBay, which ended up becoming known as the earliest known, at least at the time, Hoya Carrera ever. Then it kind of rewrote the Carrera's history. It's actually even mentioned in Jack Hoyer's autobiography. He mentions myself and Jeff Stein saying that we found this watch on eBay, and it changed the anniversary year of the Carrera. Wow. Those two, and combined, those two watches cost $5,000, maybe. Together. So those are two that kind of stand out from the vintage era. And then, of course, the Omega that launched the whole thing, which is, I think, behind me there in Frame magazine. But now the watches that mean the most to me are the ones that we create, definitely. And another watch that, has a lot of connections to a lot of things we've done since is my 5512 that I know, Blake, you're familiar with. My first vintage Rolex, I still have it. We're on the same Grado strap. That watch has inspired this watch. It inspired our Leica. It inspired a lot of what we do. And this is just a matte dial, normal 5512 from the early 70s that has this great faded bezel on it. And I bought it for, I think, $4,800 in 2010 or 11. And that's one that will be with me for a long time for sure. But that watch has acted as inspiration for a lot of other things.
Yeah, I love that watch. It's kind of responsible for getting me into like really down that hole.
Sure.
Yeah, which is really cool.
Are there any watches in your years of trading, buying and selling, that any that got away that you wish you still had and you can't get back?
Quite a few. I'm trying to think of. Oh man, where to even begin? I mean, this is a total flex answer, but so I had a Nautilus 700 in white gold, which is incredibly rare. Just exceptionally rare, and I basically I didn't have a house, but if I did, I would have had to mortgage the house to buy it in, say, 2013 or so. And, original owner, just unbelievable watch. And that watch I ended up selling to one of my friends he sold a company to Google. And he's like, I really want to celebrate with a Nautilus. Do you know of any? I was like, well, I have this. And that watch is probably worth it was expensive for me at the time. It's probably worth north of $1 million now, which is crarisy. And it was nowhere near that when I bought it or sold it.
Yeah.
So I wish I had that just for the rarity, a little bit of the value, because that's just obscene. The other ones, not as much. There's nothing that I actively miss. A mill sub. I had a mill sub for a while. Ended up trading that for another Submariner down the road. But again, it's the vintage stuff is just kind of they're just things to me. And it's it's like studies in objects. I want to study a mill sub. I want to own it. I want the experience of ownership. But something else is going to come along, and that's that. Meanwhile, the modern watches to me mean a hell of a lot more. And there's not many of those that I would ever really sell. The goal, when I buy a modern watch now, I mean, this is a 15202 that I got last year, and my AP engraved my initials and the year on the back of the movement, not even of the case. And so this Royal Oak to me means, I used to have an A series. This watch means more to me than the A series because this is my watch. It's made for me by AP, bought it from them, etc. So, with the exception of the white gold Nautilus, which is just a ridiculous thing to begin with, there's not much that I really miss.
Yeah, that's incredible that you said that. I found I had a really nice 1680 that was from the original owner, and I loved it. And it was, arguably a very handsome, kind of more handsome than the modern 114060 ceramic sub that I had. But I ended up doing a lot more things in my modern sub, with my son and with my whatever. And it became where it means more to me now. And I ended up getting rid of the 1680 just because I didn't I never wore it. Became this precious thing. And it was arguably a better looking watch and more charming and all that kind of stuff than the newer sub. But the newer sub just ended up meaning a lot more to me at the end of the day because of those experiences. And that shifted my perspective on new watches. Who's all these people, we fetishize these vintage watches for all the cool stories and all that kind of stuff. But who's somebody has to be creating that stuff now.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly why these watches mean, these watches, what I'm looking at here that you can't see, are I'm looking at a bunch of our editions in the AP and things that I had a real role in here. Those mean so much more to me than the vintage ones. The vintage watches that I mentioned you guys here, those mean a lot to me for other reasons. And those help create early stories for me from a career perspective. But again, obviously the Omega that's on the wall behind me here, that means a ton to me. There's so many watches that I wear all the time. My white dial Daytona that I got in 2016, that watch was with me, still is with me through so much. And I engrave my modern Rolexes with my name and when I get it and where I get it on the back. And that watch will be given to a son or daughter someday, we hope, and that it means a lot more to me than having some crazy rare, Palm Daytona or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just so funny to hear you guys have this conversation because not funny, but I guess affirming, because obviously tons of respect for both of you, and I personally, even out of the four of us, I'm the least knowledgeable watch person, I'm the least prolific collector, et cetera, but
you got some baller watches, Blake, come on.
But it's but what you're talking about is a feeling that I've had for a very long time. I've never been that into vintage watches, and the vintage watches that I've owned I haven't kept, and a big piece of that is I felt like it was that exact feeling of that was someone else's history, and the feeling that I have of buying new or nearly new modern watches, it's a completely different feeling, and one where I'm going to leave my mark on the new Speedmaster I just bought, and I'm not going to get rid of that. It's going to be the moon watch that I keep forever. So it's just very interesting to hear you guys have this conversation as someone who's not nearly as prolific of a collector as you guys, who's had a very similar feeling. And I feel like there are probably a lot of people out there who, you talk about the zeitgeist or sort of the hive mind of social media, who there are probably a lot of people out there who felt I got to collect vintage, but maybe they didn't feel like it was for them. And like, I think this sort of conversation is very relevant to that experience.
Yes, it's not all about arbitrage opportunities out there.
Totally.
If you're listening,
Yeah.
thinking about
That's that is a very poignant statement, Blake. I mean, it's like that is the frustration with all this stuff. And it's, again, easy for me to say from my little ivory tower here of like, oh yeah, you don't need to make money with watch. Like, it's one of those things where like we never did anything to flip watches. Like, we are now an authorized dealer, which is a totally different thing, like just buying and selling product. But it's like, yeah, like just do it because you love it. And if you don't love it, you shouldn't be doing it. And like, I was with somebody over the weekend who used to own a 15202 ST, like just the basic jumbo. And he sold it a few years ago for like, say, $35,000, which was a profit, mind you. You know, like he probably bought it for 22. And he's like, what do those go for now? And I was like, yeah, like I think like 90. And he's like, what the fuck? Like, I lost off 50 grand. I was like, you didn't lose 50 grand. Like, you did, like that didn't come out of your bank account, you know? But it's just like, that is the mindset of, I don't want to say like this generation, and not to cast aspersions on people younger than us, but like, it's the mindset of this generation of collectors. There's a new type of collector out there that is really in it for the stories, to tell their buddy wherever at the next red bar that like, yeah, I made 20 grand on this watch, or I made 50 grand on this watch. Like, it's that has become like a thing of pride with watch collectors. And that is not what it's about for sure. You know, it should be more about like, hey, as you said, Blake, like I bought this sub or a Sea Dweller or whatever. And like, you know, my first son was born with it or whatever. We went hiking, you know, and so. Like, that is a far more charming, compelling story that will also mean a lot more to that person for a longer period of time than that 20 grand he made on flipping a watch, you know?
Yeah. So we mentioned some of the smaller brands, Louis Vuitton, Ming, Autodromo. Is there any other kind of small brands that you are paying attention to these days? Or who's doing interesting stuff out there?
Yeah, Baltic, I'm a fan of. You know, I own your limited editions with them. We're a dealer of them as well. I think they do fantastic stuff. Unimatic. We have a Unimatic. I don't know when this is going to air, but we actually have a Unimatic limited edition coming very soon. Those guys have incredible sense of style, like just like epic sense of style and design. I see big things from them. I think you nailed it, though. I think Ming is doing great stuff. I have the collab with William Messina on order, the honeycomb one. I think that's great. You know, I still think, and again, I'm completely biased because he's a good friend of mine and this collector group, but I think Bradley does great stuff at Autodromo. And I think, you know, that's a brand that could really see huge growth down the road if he wanted to do it. And I respect the fact that he might not want to really, you know, kind of put the pedal down and go crazy with it. But like, he has the thoughtfulness that I don't see in many other micro brands or medium-sized or large brands. Like, he really cares about the detail in a way that almost nobody else I know does, in not only in the watch space, but in the car space, in the fashion space, whatever. He really cares about meaning behind, you know, every design choice he makes. So, you know, the guys that you mentioned, I think are right up there. Look, I think there are micro brands have many definitions. Like, you call Roger Smith a micro brand, like he makes 10 watches a year. That's kind of a micro brand. You know, I mean, he's a hero to me. So Akrivia, like, you know, obviously highly different type of watchmaking, but I think those guys are, you know, I think they're doing it the right way. And I think, you know, if anyone's looking for something that is going to be really rewarding in a multitude of ways for the long term, like look at a brand like that, or Atelier de Chronometry in Spain. You know,
their stuff is so beautiful.
You know, oh, it's so good. It's epic. You know, and again, like, they're making like 10 watches per year, and like, it's all by hand. And like, look, they're not watchmakers in the way that a Akrivia or Roger Smith is. Like, those guys are actually innovating. They're just basically taking vintage movements and kind of redesigning them and refinishing them, but still epic. You know, those will be super satisfying. And like, you know, I am lucky enough to have a Simplicity, and like, that watch is just so freaking satisfying. You know, it's just like, yeah, like, and you know, when it was worth a fraction of what it is now, it's just like, this is how things should be done the right way. Roger, the same thing. Grubel 4Z in a totally different way. Like, the absolute highest quality watches on earth, I believe, are Grubel 4Zs. You know, say what you will about what they look like and what they do, but like, there is not anybody that cares more about quality than those guys. They use machines, whereas Roger and Akrivia are more handmade. It's just what you're into. But I think there's a lot of small brands, and again, these are extremely expensive small brands that are really satisfying to me. But again, Baltic, Unimatic, Ming, and Autodromo would be among the kind of, you know, less expensive ones that I think are great.
Do you think that, like, and this is a hard question, like, do you think there are brands out there now that are kind of like germinate, like newer brands that'll germinate into things on the scale of, I mean, not necessarily like a Rolex or a Patek, because there probably never will be, but, you know, things in that sort of middle range, or, you know, like a Longines or a Tissot, like just brands that are gonna I don't know, grow and prosper, maybe become more international. You know, I'm just thinking we're talking about Bradley, and, you know, I think there's a lot of conscious decisions that are made by some of these smaller brands. We talk to them all the time. They don't want to get much larger, but yet there are, like, I'm kind of waiting. I'm waiting for one of these brands that we talk about or now to kind of jump to that next level.
It's not like we hear of Richemont Group or LVMH or Swatch like buying up small brands.
That was kind of interesting. You know?
I mean, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I think Fair is working on it. I mean, they definitely seem like a brand that has aspirations to be much larger than what they are.
Yep, that's fair.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's a few things, and we've looked into this, as I'm sure you have too. It's like making watches is a terrible business, you know, unless you own the manufacturing, right? And I think even Bradley and these guys would admit that, like, it is extremely time intensive and exhaustive, especially if you're making them in Switzerland and you don't speak French. That's a real problem. So, you know, investment grade small brands, I think, are few and far between. I mean, if you look at like an MB&F or a Journe, MB&F is independent. Journe has investors, as you know, most of you guys know, and like there's a reason for that, you know, and that is like they need a little bit of money to kind of continue to produce things at the quality that they do. I think it's really hard to do something like that and make an investment grade kind of small business, especially when the Swatches, LVMHs, Richemonts of the world, like, look at Baume & Mercier, right? I mean, Baume & Mercier was kind of like Richemont's, you know, micro brand, quote unquote, in that they were less expensive, whatever, and they really struggled to make that work, and they have all the money in the world. So, you know, I think it's tough to kind of see that. I think, you know, if somebody was doing something cool, like many of these brands are, my guess is that one of these groups would just make their own version of it, you know, kind of like rip it off, and we've seen that, of course. And look, I think there's a lot of room for growth, and I think there are some brands that are worthy of investment to go bigger. But unless you own your manufacturing and have, like, you know, a designer that, you know, is really a part of the company, it's gonna be challenging, I think, for sure.
Yeah.
But who knows? I would love to be proven wrong there. Definitely.
Yeah. You reminded me of when Baume & Mercier launched Baum, which was that exact thing. It was sort of like somebody in a boardroom was like, "What does the next generation want?" You know, and I don't think it hit.
Are we wrong, or maybe it's the kids?
Yeah,
the kids these days.
We were in the Grand Seiko boutique the other day. Zach and I, and they had these. How did you pronounce it? The H. And Joe, who he brought up the Dufour Simplicity. He's like, "Oh, you heard of Dufour?" And then how he finishes these things, and then he turned the watches over, and they were just absolutely stunning.
They are.
You know, I don't know if Grand Seiko feels like it's kind of getting into that realm of, like, people are starting to discover, like, the really special things that they're doing, like just the average person on the street, right? Like, you don't have to be, like, in the know, like, watch collector to Grand Seiko, which is doing something special.
It's an interesting also, like, case study for this my question, because I mean, Grand Seiko's been around for 60 years, Seiko's been around 140 years, and now they're starting to get to that level, and they're as big as they can be as a company. It's just really, it's like the recognition and the you know, everything else that takes so long to kind of get to.
And I wonder.
It does.
No, go ahead, Ben.
Okay. No, please.
I was just going to say, you know, I feel like talking to dealers who deal Grand Seiko, I've heard similar feedback that, like, they have customers who might have come in and bought Omegas or bought, you know, whatever brand for many years. And then once they get into Grand Seiko, after all these years of seeing them, it really sinks their teeth in, and they just kind of become Grand Seiko people. And they just, like, they're really, really focused on Grand Seiko. I'm just curious. I mean, you guys sell Grand Seiko. I think, have you had a similar experience? Do you have those Grand Seiko diehards? Do you find people learning about them and then becoming diehards?
Yeah, we do. And Grand Seiko, great example. I mean, I don't think of them as a small brand because they are a massive corporation, as you guys know, but they're small in the sense that, like, they're just not well known in the US. Incredible high quality. I mean, that's a brand, like, you know, if somebody was like, "Hey, we're going to give you a brand where you can, like, define the strategy for the next 10 years, that would be a dream project for mine." Because, like, they are making, you know, I would say consumer grade luxury watches in the same way that Rolex does, at the same quality, I would say, if not higher in some ways, you know, depending on model. And then they're also doing the Ichi stuff, which, you know, is it as good as Dufour? Who knows? It's pretty fucking close, you know? I mean, like, it is, you know, first of all, Dufour's watches came out over 15 years ago, so it's not kind of fair to do it one-to-one, but, you know, these are exceptional watches. And sometimes they just do some stuff that is just, like, a little bit misguided, that kind of, like, sets them back a step. Sometimes they get a little bit too priced for kind of, like, no apparent reason. Things like that, you know, they really want to become a real luxury competitor. But when you look at, like, Rolex, for example, like, Rolex's bread and butter are steel watches, you know? And I think, like, Seiko and Omega and Tag Heuer and everyone should mind that as they think about their own strategy. Like Rolex became Rolex selling stuff like that. Yes, they sell a lot of two-tone watches and gold watches, but like steel is what people want. And like Grand Seiko is a nerd's brand, it's a connoisseur's brand. And if there's one thing that I can say that we've learned from our audience is that our audience doesn't really care about case metal. They care about the movement, like the watch itself. And so, 10 years ago, people wanted a gold or platinum watch and didn't really care about the movement. Now people just want the basic case, which is steel, titanium, ceramic, if they want something cool, and a really great movement, And so that's why I would encourage Grand Seiko to really focus is like, beautiful stainless steel case making, which they already do with the polishing, Zaratsu, all that stuff, and focus on making stuff that people can wear every day. And I think, we talk about this often, but like the watches that mean the most to everybody, and that ranges from the John Mayers of the world to these billionaire guys that nobody's ever heard of. The watches that mean the most to all these guys are the watches on their wrist every day, which is almost inarguably a stainless steel sports watch. So like these Grand Comps and everything are wonderful. The Tourbillons are wonderful. Even the Ichi style watches are incredible. But the watches that mean the most, like the watches they'll be wearing on their deathbed, we'll say, or will be thinking of, in their final few moments, are the watches that are with them, which is an Omega Speedmaster, a steel Grand Seiko, a steel Rolex, a steel Tag Heuer, something that lives with you,
We'll start to wrap up here, but I wanted to, I mentioned it at the top, kind of half joking, but seriously, you are doing a podcast with Adam Scott, is that correct? Tell us about that.
Yeah, for sure. So, in my, exhausting amount of free time, I do this, like, I don't even say weekly because it's like semi-weekly, basically whenever we get around to a podcast with Adam Scott, who's a professional golfer, who I actually met through the watch world maybe 5 years ago. And he was a big fan of us at HODINKEE, and I was a big fan of him as like, just like the coolest guy there is. And we became friendly, and, he would kind of give me these tips that like people would die to receive. Like I played golf with him, and like to play golf with a Masters winner is mind blowing. It's like playing one-on-one with like a guy who's won the NBA Finals, the MVP. And it's like, these tips are just incredible. And he's just like the nicest guy. And I was like, dude, like we should just put this out there into the world and see what happens. And that's effectively what we're doing, is this podcast where myself, him, and another friend named Eric just talk about first the Masters, which he competed in a month ago. This past week, we had Hideki Matsuyama, who won the Masters this year on there, who's a friend of Adam's. And it's really just like this like really inside baseball look at the golf world from a total outsider in me, but a guy who loves it. My friend Eric is a little bit deeper than I am. And then Adam, who is an insider, but like the most down-to-earth, nice guy you could ask for. It'd be a little bit like having, I don't know, like Reynald, the CEO of Omega, do a podcast. You know what I mean? Like a guy who's seen everything on the industry do a podcast. Like you learn so much. And like, this is truly just for fun. We're not making a cent doing this, no promotion, no anything. And people seem to really like it. And so, if this leads to something else, cool. If not, whatever. It's just it's a fun way to kind of get exposed to a new set of listeners, I suppose. And so, yeah, that's fun. It's called Fair Game. It's on Apple, Spotify, whatever. Check it out. It's a lot of fun.
Very cool. And I noticed an article that you put up on HODINKEE not too long ago. I think it was about a Royal Oak, and I thought this is like some vintage Clymer, which was great to read. And it kind of brought back a lot of memories from old Royal Oaks and all this kind of stuff. Do you plan on writing more for the site, or you still enjoy that?
Yeah, I still enjoy it. I mean, as you guys know, like writing is kind of, one of my first loves. It's just a matter of, my role now as executive chairman. My parents still don't understand that, nor do I. My role is really like, we have 143 employees now. We have an office in Atlanta that has a very different culture than the office in New York. We have a CEO that's based in London, who, thanks to our friends in politics, hasn't been able to come to the United States at all since we did this deal. So my role now is kind of, just playing connector between all three and ensuring that the ship is headed in the right direction, which I'm proud to say it is. And so, the writing stuff, I love it. The Royal Oak story, was definitely inspired by the Royal Oak I have here. And I love it, and I will always be part of the editorial team at HODINKEE for sure. It's just a matter of how much time, as you guys well know, writing takes way more time than I think people realize, in particular good writing. So, yeah, I hope to be on there more often, hope to be on the more podcast videos. I just filmed the Talking Watches with somebody that should be coming out pretty soon. That could be cool. So, yeah, I'm always around there and hope to be more around there.
All right, well, that's exciting to hear. We always enjoy reading you, and hopefully we'll be able to get together in person sometime soon in the city, grab a beer, and nerd out over watches.
Yeah, we'd love that.
Yeah, Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to come on today. It's been a huge pleasure.
My pleasure, and congratulations on 10 years, guys.
Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, thanks for listening, everyone.